Hello, Blogging Heads viewers. I am Dr. Robert Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at University of Kentucky. And today with me is Mark Dubowitz, who is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and is also head of the Iran Energy Project and the Iran Human Rights Project at FDD. This episode of Foreign Entanglements represents, in some sense, a continuation of the previous episode in which my co-host Matt Duss spoke with Michael Singh about the same thing that we're going to talk about today, which is about sanctions on Iran. How are you doing today, Mark?
Good, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Good, fantastic. Well, let's just start out. You had a op-ed in the New York Times, which made an argument about sanctions, a relatively optimistic argument about sanctions, in which you argued that essentially the American political process, the American government, broadly conceived, ought to, in some sense, depoliticize the pursuit of a robust sanctions regime against Iran, and by this sort of quiet down some of the criticism on the right of the president, sort of quiet down or maybe dismiss some of the criticism on the left of the president on the sanctions regime, and pursue what may well be an effective set of sanctions against Iran. Is that a fair characterization of your argument, or, I mean, would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, sure, Rob. I mean, I think what I was really getting at in the New York Times piece is that there is actually a fair amount of bipartisan support for a robust sanctions policy, and there are voices on the left and voices on the right that are critical of sanctions, that are skeptical of sanctions, and I think I remain a skeptic. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that sanctions are really going to work in achieving the objective for which they were designed, which was to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program. But I do think that we should continue what we've seen in Congress, which is an overwhelming bipartisan support for tough sanctions against the Iranian regime, really crippling sanctions against its energy sector, its financial sector, telecommunications, telecom sector. And I think these sanctions have certainly done enormous economic damage to the regime, and they are the only reason the regime is now sitting in Istanbul negotiating with the P5+1. So I think this is an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats to unite against a tough sanctions policy. And then I think there's plenty of room to criticize this administration on its overall Iran policy with respect to some of the other aspects of it. And I think you and I should talk about that. But with respect to sanctions, strong bipartisan support. Let's continue it. Let's intensify the sanctions. This is not the time to let up.
Right. Do you think, I mean, I have a lot of different ways to approach this. My first question is, do you think that this is a plausible approach to this kind of foreign policy question, which does, I mean, some foreign policy questions don't matter really for elections because they don't, they just don't matter for the campaign because nobody cares about them. Iran isn't necessarily one of those, right? And, people and, especially some concentrated interest groups actually do care about the situation with Iran. Do you think it's plausible that during what will likely be a fairly tightly contested presidential race, unless something happens that we're, completely blindsided by, it's probably going to be a tight presidential race, it's going to be a tight race for the Senate, it's going to be a tight race for the House. Is it plausible to believe that we can have essentially a degree of domestic coherence on this sanctions project moving forward during the next 8 months, which it seems like almost everyone thinks is going to be a pretty critical 8 months in terms of the actual progress of the Iranian nuclear program, and especially in the progress of the negotiations which are happening right now. Right, I'm sure you're familiar with the Friedman unit that the 6 more months will be critical, but it does kind of seem like the next 6 to 8 months will be really critical. And so how reasonable is it to believe that we actually will be able to achieve a degree of bipartisan coherence while everybody's trying to keep their job?
Look, I think on the narrow sanctions question, I don't think the election is going to be won or lost on sanctions policy. I mean, I think, again, the Congress, particularly with Republican leadership, has really led the way on tough measures at the congressional level. I think the administration has done a very good job of building a robust multilateral sanctions coalition. And I think together, the executive branch and Congress, both parties have really done a pretty remarkable job in implementing an effective policy that to date has put enormous economic pressure on the regime, though again, I see no evidence that it's changed the risk-reward calculus of the regime with respect to its nuclear weapons program. So on narrow sanctions policy, I would expect at least a degree of strong bipartisan support as we move forward. On the broader Iran question, I think there's ample opportunity for the parties to distinguish themselves on the issue, and there's certainly, the administration has some serious questions to answer with respect to its broader Iran policy, and I hope it's a robust campaign, and those questions are asked, and the president is forced to answer that. But on sanctions itself, I don't see this election won or lost on the question of sanctions.
Right. Although the specific nature of sanctions, there are some sanctions that are extremely robust, and that a good negotiating posture might at least hold in reserve. You've suggested at different times some of the banking sanctions and so forth that can be dialed up or dialed down, and where there might be some degree of difference opinion between the two parties. But I guess I'm going to seize on one of the comments you just made, and you've had, I think, a good defense, and you're right that there is this fairly broad bipartisan consensus on sanctions program writ large, and it does seem to be within the American political context an entirely defensible and widely held position. But as you just pointed out, it may have driven them to the table in Istanbul, but as of yet, there's little indication that it has affected Iran's pursuit of what it sees to be its ends, right? And so, to what extent then can we expect an even tighter sanctions regime to have much of an effect on Iran's behavior? In other words, are we talking about American political coherence for something that's essentially irrelevant to Iran's political calculus right now, or is there a vision in which Iran does change its behavior because of these sanctions?
It's a great question, and I think we don't know yet. We do know that the Iranians are at the table in Istanbul because they are finally under the kind of crippling sanctions pressure that they should have been under years ago. And they are fearing for their oil wealth for the first time since the Iran-Iraq war. There is a international sanctions regime in place that's making it excruciatingly difficult for them to transact through the formal financial system. There is clearly a set of energy sanctions that are making it very difficult for them to trade their oil. Countries are significantly reducing the purchase of Iranian oil, and their oil revenue is being reduced significantly. So the sanctions are having a major impact on the Iranian economy. Inflation rate is formally, officially at 20%, unofficially at 40 to 50%. You've got high unemployment, no growth, a stagflationary environment. The Iranian currency is almost worthless. It's plunged by more than 50% in a few months. And so this is an economy under severe economic stress, and sanctions have played a major role in putting it under that stress. And so I think that what we're going to see now over the next few months will be critical on the question of whether those sanctions have changed the Iranians' risk-reward calculus and whether we're going to see meaningful concessions at the negotiating table that comply with a series of UN Security Council resolutions that demand the complete cessation of Iran's nuclear weapons activities. Now, therein lies the possibility of some real partisan disagreement between Republicans and Democrats over what constitutes a meaningful concession and what the United States should be willing to give up with respect to sanctions relief, because that's what the Iranians will demand. And I think you will see a fair amount of disagreement between the executive branch and Congress, between Democrats and Democrats, between Democrats and Republicans, between the Europeans and the United States. Certainly the Russians are going to probably go their own way, as they always do on these questions, and the Iranians are trying to divide the international coalition, and they'll be targeting the Russians and the Chinese in particular to try and divide this coalition. So fair amount of opportunity for some disagreement and dissension over the next few months as these talks unfold. But again, I think with respect to sanctions, I think everybody is on the same page that sanctions need to be intensified, because really they are the only peaceful way to deal with this issue. If sanctions don't work and some of the other techniques don't work, like sabotage and assassinations and introducing faulty equipment in the proliferation supply chain, and many of the things that have been part of the covert war against Iran, then we are left with no good other alternatives but potentially military strikes to stop this Iranian nuclear program. And I think everybody wants to ensure we try everything before we get there.
Right. I mean, we'll get back to the military strikes. I think it is worth noting, again, worth reinforcing what you just suggested earlier, which is that this current sanctions effort really is multilateral, that it's seen really a tremendous amount of support in Europe, a tremendous amount of support from quarters where you wouldn't necessarily suspect it to have much support. It's wrong exactly to say that the Chinese are on board, but they kind of vaguely seem okay with it. The Indians have taken some steps, some sort of halting steps to support the sanctions regime. So this really is a broad multilateral effort. It's not just the U.S. government, although the U.S. government obviously plays a very substantial role. But it's also very interesting to me. I mean, what you just said about the point at which the Iranian government can pursue driving a wedge between all of the other or all of the actors here, and especially all the multilateral actors, but even the domestic actors in the United States. And I guess it goes to another question that I have regarding how difficult it is for this multilateral coalition and for the U.S. government to say yes, and I think this is the point that Matt and Mike also touched on. How difficult is it going to be for this coalition to say yes or no to an Iranian offer that is less than 100%? And I also want to talk in a second about what less than 100% means. I mean, it seems to me almost natural that the Iranians are going to come up with something that is between 10 and 90% of what the United States wants in order to divide the coalition. And how do you keep a coalition together when the Iranians come back with that kind of offer?
Well, I think it's going to be tricky. I mean, I think the first thing that the United States needs to do is really involve the Israelis in these discussions. I mean, they're not at the table. They're obviously not part of the P5+1, but they're a major actor and a major factor. So I think it'll be very important that the United States closely coordinate with the Israeli government to ensure that if we don't get to 100%, that the Israelis, the United States, the rest of the P5+1 are all on the same page with respect to what constitutes a meaningful and reasonable concession on the part of the Iranians. I think the second thing is these concessions. We can talk in specifics about what's important and what is not important to negotiators, but ultimately the concessions have to be concessions that are, for the most part, irreversible. Because the reversible concessions, the concessions that the Iranians could really turn on a dime and change, are not going to be meaningful. The concessions that we will have no way to verify through intrusive inspections are not meaningful, because again, the Iranians have shown a propensity to lie, to cheat, and to really move ahead with this program in a covert fashion. And so it's going to be important that these concessions be irreversible, they be meaningful, and they be verifiable. And I think if that's the case, then where they are on that continuum between 0 and 100% will be less important than how sustainable these are, and whether they actually enjoy the support of not only the P5+1, but the Israelis as well, who are going to be a major factor in this calculation.
Right. Let's talk about irreversibility. I mean, what exactly are we talking about in terms of irreversible connections? Things that, I guess there are different degrees of irreversibility. It's not absolute, right? There are some things where the Iranians could change their mind and effectively change their mind over the course of, say, 5 years. And there are other things, as we see with North Korea, where they make an agreement not to launch ballistic missiles, or at least we say they made an agreement not to launch ballistic missiles, and then the next day they try to launch a ballistic missile. So what are the things that are irreversible that you're thinking about in terms of Iranian concessions?
Well, I think everybody's obviously very concerned about uranium enrichment, particularly uranium enrichment that's military grade. And the question is, are we willing to allow the Iranians to enrich at some low level in exchange for a meaningful, verifiable commitment that they will not enrich uranium to military grade level, or certainly to even 20%, which takes them about 90% of the way there to military-grade uranium. I think the question of whether we can actually have inspections there and the scope of those inspections, how intrusive they are, because this is a widely dispersed nuclear program. I think everybody agrees with that. And the ability of the IAEA to go anywhere they want at any time, examine any facility, is critical. Because without that ability, we'll have no way of knowing whether the Iranians are indeed engaged in covert enrichment or covert weaponization, and that'll be a critical element. On the flip side of the debate is what we give up, and the question of concessions and sanctions relief is very important, because there are certain sanctions that we can relax without a meaningful impact on the coalition. And on the sanctions regime. There are other sanctions that if we were to relax, I think the fear is that the entire sanctions regime would fall apart and the coalition would also disintegrate. And so we have to be very careful on how we give concessions with respect to sanctions relief, and that we only give meaningful sanctions concessions in exchange for meaningful, irreversible, verifiable commitments on the part of the Iranians. And it's going to be tricky. It's going to be tricky to figure out how to characterize that. And I think there'll be a lot of disagreement between the administration and Congress, between the various parties in the P5+1, and between various experts on what constitutes verifiable, irreversible concessions on the part of the Iranians, and what constitutes meaningful sanctions relief that's not going to lead to the dissolution of the sanctions regime that the administration has spent the past 3 years assiduously putting together, and deserves much credit for doing so. So it's going to be very tricky. I'm deeply skeptical that these negotiations will work. I'm hopeful. I think that certainly this is the best chance that we've ever had. These sanctions have now become so crippling that if these don't work, then we may be left with very few peaceful options. And so I think everybody's hoping that there will be a successful resolution in Istanbul and then I guess in Baghdad, the second stage of these negotiations. But I'll just end with this point. We've just got to be very careful that we don't get rope-a-dope the way we have in the past. The Iranians are masters of the rope-a-dope, and they can play this along and get us into a sanctions process, or I should say a diplomatic process, where they buy more time to build a nuclear weapon, and our ability to actually respond to that becomes less and less effective.
Right. So I guess, and this is an important point, when you are talking about what this sanctions regime is going to look like after the Iranians have made verifiable, irreversible concessions, we are still looking at in Iran, even in the best case scenario for the Tehran government, we are still looking at an Iranian state which is deeply sanctioned, right? Is still deeply tied down by international sanctions, right? I mean, this gives them maybe a little bit more breathing space to develop a more robust economy or something along those lines. But at least in the immediate future, and I do want to return to this point as well, unless something else fundamental about the nature of the regime changes, we're still looking at a regime here which is dealing with fairly heavy sanctions, right? Is that how you envision this situation?
Well, it is, but I would draw a distinction. I mean, there are various types of sanctions. There are economic sanctions, which really are the sanctions that get the most play, focused on their financial sector, on their oil sector. There are sanctions that have been put in place to respond to the fact that the Iranians are the foremost sponsors of terrorism around the world. So there have been individuals and entities that have been designated because of their support for terrorism. An example would be the Al-Quds Force, which is the overseas division of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps responsible for terrorist activities around the world. There are counterproliferation sanctions that are really put in place to deny the Iranians access to parts and components for their nuclear weapons program. And then there are human rights sanctions that are a response to the brutal repression that the Iranian government has leveled against the Iranian people. So there are four major types of sanctions. And I think that we have the ability, if we were to get major concessions on the nuclear program, perhaps to relax some of the economic sanctions and give them some sanctions relief there. But I would argue that we should keep in place the counterterrorism sanctions, the counterproliferation sanctions, and the human rights sanctions until the Iranians show that they're willing to behave in a more responsible fashion, to stop the brutal repression of their people, to stop sponsoring international terrorism. And we certainly need to have counterproliferation sanctions in place, because the Iranians, I don't think, can be trusted not to try to reconstitute their nuclear weapons program if indeed we are able to slow it down. So I think those three groups of sanctions can still be put in place unless the Iranians change their behavior. Economic sanctions is where we could probably provide a little more relief.
Right. So I guess from an Iranian point of view right now, the choice that you would suggest, and I think that it's probably correct to say that we're offering here, is between a situation in which they verifiably are not working towards a nuclear program, but yet they remain effectively a pariah state, one that is is deeply sanctioned for pursuing what, and you know, I have no apology for Iranian foreign policy, but for what many in Tehran believe is pursuit of Iranian defensive objectives, right? Or Iranian defensive is the wrong term. Iranian security objectives. We have a choice between that, where Iran is no longer working towards a nuclear program, but you know is still sanctioned for its foreign policy, effectively, or what it believes to be its foreign policy, and various other things that it does to shore up the regime, and between undergoing, as you suggest, some series of rounds of airstrikes from Israel and or the United States. And I guess when I'm thinking about that and when I frame it in those terms, I can completely understand why some people in Tehran, don't necessarily say, bring it on, but are willing to say, well, that's not much of a choice. And given that that's not much of a choice, maybe it's worth risking a flurry of Israeli airstrikes, or even a combined flurry of American and Israeli airstrikes over a period of time. I mean, this is not the first time that regimes have made such a calculation. Regimes can endure airstrikes in pursuit of objectives that they think are really important. And so, that when you frame it the way you framed it, I guess airstrikes don't seem like enduring airstrikes doesn't seem like such a bad idea from the Iranian perspective.
Well, Rob, I again, just to clarify, I think there are four groups of sanctions. I think the Iranians, if they were to concede on their nuclear weapons program in a meaningful, verifiable way, then I think they would get potentially sanctions relief on the economic front, which right now is really the greatest threat to the regime and the regime's survival. I mean, the fact that these sanctions are crippling their oil wealth, which is really the lifeblood of the regime, the fact that they cannot transact through the formal financial system, that most of their banks have been designated, they've been thrown off, the SWIFT system, so they can't even process electronic financial transactions. Their ships are really ships non grata in foreign ports. So, their economy is really being squeezed. And I think that's what the regime is most concerned about. So I think we can provide sanctions relief on the economic front if we get meaningful, verifiable concessions on the nuclear weapons issue. With respect to terrorism, human rights abuses, and the issue of proliferation, again, in the most cases, those sanctions are applied against individuals who've been designated for human rights abuses or support for terrorism. In other cases, they have been applied against certain entities within the Iranian regime, against the IRGC subsidiaries, divisions. And I think that there are, again, we have some flexibility that if the Iranians begin to show that they are willing to be responsible actors in the international community and not support global terrorism, not brutalize their own people, and not try and procure parts and equipment for a nuclear program that they're supposed to be suspending verifiably and irreversibly, then I think we can offer sanctions relief, but we can do so in a calibrated way. So I'm not sure the choice is so binary between a decision to relent but still suffer punishing sanctions, or not relent and suffer punishing airstrikes. I think there is a third way, and that is for them to start to give meaningful concessions and for us to give meaningful sanctions relief, but do so in a careful, calibrated way, and to bring.
I guess I have to disagree with at least part of that point there. And again, I intend and I offer no apology for Tehran's domestic repression and for its support of terrorism. But I do quite believe that there are lots of people in Tehran who firmly believe that the repression is necessary to keep the Islamic Republic in surviving, right? That if they had not exerted the degree of, especially with regards to the abortive Green Revolution, had they not exerted that degree of repression, that the regime would no longer survive. And I also, I'm sure that there are people in Tehran who are absolutely committed to the notion that they need to maintain strong support for Hamas and Hezbollah and for a variety of other terrorist organizations in order to provide a degree of security for the Islamic Republic against, whatever, or at least a degree of influence for the Islamic Republic in the wider world. And so, it seems to me that there are going to be lots of people in Tehran who, in fact, do see it as a binary choice. They do see it as either that there is no other option in terms of pursuing or trying to get the human rights sanctions removed and trying to get the terrorism sanctions removed, because those are critical elements of extant Islamic Republic foreign policy and domestic policy. And so that's the argument I suspect is going to be brought to the table in internal deliberations in Tehran. And I think it's hard to argue against that perspective.
Well, I actually think I think it's easy to argue against that perspective, because I think that the counterterrorism sanctions and the human rights sanctions and the counterproliferation sanctions are not sanctions that represent a threat to the survival of the regime. Right? The economic sanctions are. The economic sanctions, if they're crippling enough, could take down the Iranian economy, bring it to its knees, and potentially bring down the regime. And I think that's what really concerns.
Do we have evidence of that, actually? You've mentioned that a couple times, but do we actually have evidence of these kinds of sanctions bringing down a regime?
Well, we do. I think we have evidence of tough economic sanctions bringing down the apartheid regime in South Africa. I was born in South Africa. I lived in South Africa, and I remember how punishing those economic sanctions were against South Africa's economy, and they completely changed the risk-reward calculus of South Africa's Afrikaners with respect to the fundamental choice between keeping apartheid and remaining, essentially remaining a pariah nation, or beginning to transform the nature of that regime. There was a change in regime in South Africa. It was regime change, pure and simple, right? And
there was also renunciation of nuclear weapons too, which makes it a second, and the dismantling of a nuclear weapons program. It also seems that there are a lot of failures, and I've seen South Africa experts sort of really dispute the parallel between Iran and South Africa as well, sort of saying that there was a clear argument, there was a clear understanding that as soon as South Africa made a relatively or certainly revolutionary concessions domestically, that it was quickly and easily going to be welcomed back into the family of nations, where there seems to be relatively little guarantee of that in terms of Iran. But that's it, because I asked you to tell me one and you told me one. So, but it seems like and it's not a bad one. It's a good one. But there seem to be some bad ones too, like Cuba and North Korea, right, and Iraq, where sort of dreadful economic damage has yet to, well, in Iraq's case, obviously military action, but has yet to actually bring a authoritarian regime down.
Well, I think that's right, though I think sanctions actually worked in Iraq's case from a counterproliferation perspective. They really, in combination with the threat of military force, sanctions actually worked to strip Saddam Hussein of his nuclear weapons capability, as we learned too late when we invaded Iraq in 2003. I think sanctions against Cuba, interestingly enough, that's sort of always presented as the classic case of sanctions failure. And in some respects, it wasn't successful because it didn't lead to a regime change in Havana. But, I don't remember this because I wasn't alive, but I'm sure for those who do remember this, the early 1960s was a time when Cuba was seen to be a national security threat to the United States, because it was 90 miles from Florida, and it was an outpost of Soviet potential Soviet aggression against the American homeland. And today, Cuba is not considered to be a major national security threat. So certainly sanctions boxed in Cuba contain Cuba.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure that sanctions against Cuba actually destroyed the Soviet Union, which seems to be the key factor.
Well, I think sanctions played a role in also containing Soviet influence around the world in key spots. I think Cuba is an example. I
think we might actually get a replay of something like this because I would disagree entirely with that. I would say that sanctions against Cuba probably radically increased Soviet influence in Cuba, radically increased the amount of economic aid that the Soviet Union was willing to give to Cuba. But, and I think this is maybe your stronger point here, is there is no Soviet Union to do this with Iran, right? And in fact, Iran doesn't even have a China like North Korea does, right? And so in some sense, it might make more sense to refer to the example you gave before, the South Africa example, which was, really a genuinely isolated regime in a way that even North Korea isn't necessarily right now. And Iran has many of those same aspects that it doesn't have. I mean, the Russians want to play and the Chinese want to play, but nobody thinks that they're willing to put up or shut up with the case to Iran. So.
Right, there's no superpower patron. I think when it comes to the Iranian regime, I think the key point here is that the existential threat to the mullahs in Tehran is not from the United States, it's not from Israel, it's not from sanctions, it's not from military strikes. The existential threat in their minds is from the Iranian people. I mean, June 2009 was a watershed event in Iran. It was an opportunity that we missed when millions of people were on the street yelling death to the dictator. And I think that the mullahs understand too well that put under enough economic pressure, the combination of tough economic sanctions, along with the fact that this is a regime considered to be illegitimate by the majority of Iranians, puts them in a position where the only way they're going to survive is if they make meaningful concessions on their nuclear weapons program. I think that if they do so, there will be a huge momentum internationally to try and bring the Iranian regime back into the international community. I think you will see sanctions relief, particularly on the economic front. I think it'll be more difficult for them to get sanctions relief with respect to their terrorist activities, human rights abuses, and certainly we're not going to relax on counterproliferation sanctions. I think that would be very ill-advised. But I think that their best way forward for regime survival is to make concessions on the nuclear program. Now, if they don't, and the negotiations don't work, and the sanctions will intensify. I mean, I think we are, if the dial goes to 10 on sanctions, this one is at 7. And I think that, to quote, Spinal Tap, does this one go to 11? I think this one can't go to 11. And I think it'll go to 11 if these negotiations fail. And then I think that I believe I'm one of the few people in Washington that believes this. I actually think President Obama, if he is reelected, and there are no other peaceful alternatives left, and the Iranians are marching to a nuclear weapon, I believe that the United States the president will order military strikes against Iran to stop that nuclear weapons program. I think that the president is deeply committed to stopping them, and I think he will find very strong bipartisan support for that in 2013 or 2014 if he has to do that. And that will ultimately lead to the downfall of this regime.
From someone who studies a lot of air power, I have to wonder, don't you mean 2013 and 2016 and 2019 and 2022? Because that's what we're talking about in terms, because airstrikes cannot, I think almost everybody agrees, fundamentally destroy any sort of Iranian nuclear program, right? They can only delay an Iranian nuclear program.
I think I think that's true, though. I would say that I think that the Iranian regime is built on the perception of their omnipotence, of their power, and of their hold over the Iranian people. I think that if military strikes were successful in setting back that nuclear weapons program, and by the way, if they're U.S. military strikes, I mean, my assumption is it's not only Iran's nuclear facilities, that they will go after the IRGC, they will go after the Basij, they will go after elements of the Iranian military, and I think it'll be a humiliation of historic proportions for this regime.
Right, and I suspect that whoever's president of Iran after the last bomb drops is going to stand up on a dais and declare victory, and that a lot of people are going to believe him. Because he will say, we have resisted the imperialists, they have stopped bombing us. Maybe we shot down an F-16 or an F-18 along the way. And I mean, that may well be enough to argue that they've avoided humiliation. I mean, this isn't a case where you have a Serbia situation where, they lost Kosovo. They obviously lost Kosovo. And there was no way to say we didn't lose Kosovo. And, it was losing Kosovo rather than all the battering of the Serbian regime that really brought down Milosevic.
Yeah, Rob, I disagree. I think the Iranian people, when the economic ministry sends out inflation statistics in Iran, the majority of Iranians laugh because they know that this is a regime that has consistently lied to them about even basic economic data. So I think that if they were to actually be the recipient of punishing U.S. military strikes against their nuclear facilities, against the IRGC, and against elements of their military, and they were to stand up at the end of it and say, we resisted the U.S. imperialists, and we are still standing, I think the majority of Iranians would not respond positively.
That just depends on how you define victory, right? If the Iranians start out with the assumption, the argument that the United States and Israel are pursuing regime change, which undoubtedly they will argue, then the survival of the regime in itself is a sign of victory. But, listen, maybe we'll find out, right? I mean, we'll look 2 years down the road, and, from my point of view, it'll be a fascinating case, because, again, I study air power. And so we'll see. So, and we talked about this a little when we tried to have this discussion previously. If we do get what sort of amount to, or at least most, or very substantial concessions that can be defined as irreversible, as verifiable, and so forth. And 2 years down the road, the Russians decide to sell their S-300s and even their more advanced air defense network to the Iranians. And maybe the Chinese decide to sell some J-10s and maybe even some more advanced electronic warfare aircraft to Iran, which is not absurd. I mean, they're not doing it right now, but you never know, right? I mean, they might decide to sell that kind of equipment, or and more generally, they decide to help refurbish the Iranian air defense network and the Iranian Air Force. And what happens if the Iranians start testing just how reversible their commitments are? If you understand my meaning, right? The first time is, well, somebody doesn't really get into the site they're inspecting as quickly as they can. And the second time, it looks like stuff is moved around and so forth. There's still a lot of ways to slice the salami, even if we get irreversible verifiable concessions at this point, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely, and I would expect that if this regime stays in power, this regime will do exactly what you've described. I mean, I think that this will be we are going to be dealing with this for years. As long as this regime stays in power, this is a regime that will continue to challenge the United States and challenge the international community on all fronts, on the nuclear weapons front, terrorism, human rights, etc. And I think we just have to be continued commitment and diligence. I think sanctions play a very important role in that respect. Economic sanctions, counterproliferation sanctions, human rights sanctions, counterterrorism sanctions, all of those have to be kept in place, and they're going to have to be intensified when we find the Iranians cheating, which they invariably are going to. And that is why, I think many people are skeptical that there is any value in any deal with this regime. And I think that there is some, I understand that skepticism, because this is not a regime that has shown itself to be genuinely committed to a deal and certainly complying with elements of a deal. This is a regime that even if we find in the next 6 months, please God, that they're willing to meet their international commitments under Security Council resolutions, we will have to keep a robust sanctions regime in place. We will have to have inspectors there who have unfettered access. And if the Iranians cheat, we will have to respond in kind and show that we are actually committed as an international community to keeping them from getting a nuclear weapon and from keeping them from doing the kind of irresponsible activities and behavior that they're famous for. But that is why Iran remains the number one national security challenge for the United States, and I think will be for years.
Right. I'm more of an Asia specialist. I'm not really an Asia specialist, but I don't entirely agree with that. But that's really another conversation. Do you have any? Do you have anything else? Anything else to ask, or any other points you want to make I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job here of pushing through some of the sort of the major questions.
Yeah, again, I think I would just sort of conclude by saying too often people think of sanctions as some kind of silver bullet. They're not a silver bullet. At best they can be sort of silver shrapnel. And I think shrapnel can wound this regime, which is suffering a crisis of domestic legitimacy. It's suffering a severe economic crisis. I think it's under enormous stress. And I think this is the most robust sanctions regime the Iranian regime has ever faced. And again, sanctions are just one tool in our toolbox. They need to be part of a comprehensive strategy. And I think if they are, we may have some chance of dealing with this threat. But it's clear that we need to have a credible military threat on the table. The president continues to remind the Iranians of that. I think he's sincere, and I think he is deeply committed to ensuring that there is no Iranian nuclear weapon. I hope we'll see some bipartisan support for sanctions going forward over the next 6 months, and then a very robust discussion about the administration's Iran policy, where I think it's mostly failed is one on creating unnecessary tension with the Israelis, because I think that's really been a massive distraction, and I think undercuts our ability to deal with the Iranian problem. And number two, most importantly, we have just not given the kind of support to the Iranian opposition that we really should. We missed a massive opportunity in June 2009. I think the president acknowledges that was a mistake, and I think we should be providing not only rhetorical and political support to the opposition, but real material support. Iran is a police state today, and I just had a piece in the Wall Street Journal today about Western companies selling technology to the Iranian regime in the telecom sector and in their high-tech sector, and they're using sophisticated technology that allows them to track a encrypted message that's sent from a cell phone to another cell phone in Iran, track that in 6 minutes, kick down the door, and seize the phone. I mean, it is remarkable how sophisticated the Iranian regime is in hunting dissidents using Western technology. And I think that's another example of where sanctions could be very useful in convincing Western companies to stop doing business with us, Iran.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's entirely fair. We may disagree about the degree to which there was any opportunity to topple the regime in 2009. I'm a little bit more skeptical, I think, than you are. But I'm not an Iran specialist, and probably my co-host might be able to have a better conversation with you on that, which I think in the future maybe we should think about. We should think about having you back on.
That'd be great, Rob. Thanks for having me.
All right, wonderful. And Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you for watching. And next week we'll have something about something foreign. And have a good weekend. Although this is Saturday, you're probably not going to see this till Monday. Have a lovely week. And we will be back soon.